All right. Hey guys, welcome back. This is going to be our sixth lecture of Unit 4. And we're in the Jackson presidency. We just had the Native American Removal Act, the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee, and the 5 civilized tribes, the Seminoles fighting back. And today we're going to start talking about a little bit more of life in America at this point in time. This is the 1830s. And there's an amazing book that kind of encapsulates life in America during this time, and it's called Democracy in America, written by a Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville. It's kind of an outsider's view of what our society, our culture was like. And Alexis de Tocqueville, who's a French aristocrat born during the Napoleonic Wars, his family had been heavily uh, troubled during the French Revolution. It was just getting back on its feet. And young Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, and his friend, Gustave de Beaumont, they were tasked under the new French regime to go and visit America's penitentiary system, our prisons. So they do that, and they basically crisscross America. They go to Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, the New Orleans, all around the entire country by steamboat, in stagecoach, on horseback, walking. For 9 months, they tour America. And when they return to France, Beaumont very quickly writes this detailing account of how America's prison systems work to hopefully benefit France. And Alexis de Tocqueville, he got busy writing this book on the larger society in America because he was fascinated with how our democracy worked. As remember, at this time, most of the European powers, pretty much all of them, were still monarchies in various forms. America was the great experiment. And so this was a look for Europeans and to see how American democracy worked and learn more about America. And this was a look for Americans to see more about themselves and how our own country worked. And he identified some of the things that made America good and some of the things that made America bad. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but his values, these 5 values he identifies, have become famous for American exceptionalism. Um, so the values he identifies in a broader sense, you'll need to remember for like the STAR test and for, moving forward. If you hear Alexis de Tocqueville, these are like the pop phrases to keep in mind. The first one is liberty, obviously freedom. Um, the second one is egalitarianism. This is equality. He said the great question of our times. And equality or egalitarianism, this is something that Americans had more so than in Europe because we did not have a hierarchical system. We did not have a caste system like in most places in Europe. In Europe, if you were a member of the aristocracy, the nobility, then you were always going to have that landed title, that position, a baron, a baroness, a duke, a duchess, count and countess, and so on. Versus if you were born of the poorer class, like a peasant, you had no hope of ever escaping that. In America, though, that was not the case at all. And this goes along with his next value, individualism. America was a nation of individuals because we had no hierarchical aristocracy, no landed nobility. So in America, even if you were born the poorest of the poor, you could always hope to make something better of yourself. You weren't stuck in that same position that would be inescapable. Remember, even like in Europe, the position you were in, there was no reason to like work harder. There was no reason you couldn't marry out of it. There was no escaping it. But in America, you could marry better than your station. You could work hard and rise above. This is how like later on in the 1800s, we'll see the rise of the captains of industry, the robber barons, men like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, who will start off as the lowest of the low, immigrants and the sons of con men, and they will become the richest men in the world. That was only something that could have happened in a place such as America. It could not happen back in Europe. So that's individualism. And then populism. You remember, we the people. This is the idea of power resting with the populace, popular sovereignty. And he does warn about, through individualism and populism, that there could be in America a tyranny of the majority. That with everyone basically being the same, because we're all individuals, you could have the masses kind of all becoming locked in the same culture. This is like pop culture today. You can kind of see this tyranny of the majority. Those who, find something else meaningful, they get persecuted. Those who don't fit in with the masses become less than. He does warn about the tyranny of the majority and the warnings of individualism, each of these things. With the liberty, he also warns of the great irony that we are a nation of equals and we're a nation of rising democracy. Because remember, the Jacksonian era sees more of the common people, at least white men, able to participate in their governments than practically anywhere else in the world. Remember, that was the election of 1828. You had most of the states having the actual people decide who the electors would be rather than the state governments. But he does warn, he points out the terrible hypocrisy with our liberty, with that value that while we're doing all this, we also own slaves. And he does say that there will come a reckoning, America. That is not a hypocrisy that will be able to stand the test of time. And then finally, his last value that he extols is on our capitalism. In America, we value money above everything else because we're a nation of individuals who can rise up beyond the circumstances of their birth. Money is everything versus like in Europe, yeah, money's important, but if you're nobility, you're always going to have it. If you're a peasant, you're never going to be able to get enough of it. So it didn't, in other words, become the measure of your worth as a human being. Versus in America, that was totally your worth, how much money you have, and that's still the case today. We call this idea capitalism, but for Alexis de Tocqueville, Frenchman, this is an idea that you need to make sure you're aware of moving forward. It's going to be incredibly important. It's called laissez-faire. And laissez-faire or laissez-faire, it means basically in French, let it be, and it refers to the idea of government allowing business to function free of regulations or government influence. It's a hands-off approach. So if I do this, I'm talking about laissez-faire. But it's capitalism, baby. It's talking about, we value the dollar. Business is free to succeed in America. People are free to decide their business interest in America. That is laissez-faire. And so he writes this book, Democracy in America, and it becomes very important to figuring out, what values our country's based on. And it's still based on today. Many politicians, even into the 20th and 21st centuries, they quote Alexis de Tocqueville and kind of judge and debate the merits of the values that make us the United States. There you go. That was in the 1830s. He wrote the book. It was published in 1835. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the tariff debate, otherwise known as the nullification crisis. And so this goes back to the Tariff of Abominations that was passed by Congress during the election year in 1828, signed into law by JQA, John Quincy Adams. And JQA wasn't like the person who created this bill or like had his minions in Congress pass it, but he signed it into law because this is a key part of the American system, Henry Clay's American plan, that we have tariffs to protect American industry. Now, the tariff of abominations, it set a pretty hefty tariff. It wasn't outrageous, but it set like a 37% rate or something on imported manufacturing goods and a 45% tariff rate on imported raw materials. Now, for the South, they saw this as absolutely detestable, as abominable, as the nickname they gave it testifies. For the South, remember, they're agriculturally based. They got that cotton they're exporting to the world. Since they don't have a lot of industry because they're so reliant on their agricultural crops, they have to import most of their manufactured goods that they want. So like clothing, they mostly buy from the northern part of the United States. Isn't that funny? Southern cotton would, a lot of it, go to the northern part of the United States, be made into clothing, and then sold back to the South. They would need to buy, the tools and implements, the furniture, everything that was made, wasn't really made in the South. So this is going to hurt the South. They're going to have to pay a premium, that tax, that tariff on all these manufactured goods. And the other point that the Southerners, men like South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne will point out as they debate this in Congress, was that with Britain, our main trade ally for the cotton trade especially, having to suffer because of this tariff and not be able to sell as much of their manufactured goods to the United States because of this tariff, that will diminish Britain's purchasing power, and Britain will not be able to buy as much of our cotton, which will then again hurt the South. So Hayne and other Southerners, they are absolutely furious because they see this as a partisan hack job. They see this as something, this tariff, that only benefits the North, and especially the Northeast, to the detriment of the South and of the West. And you can see on this map here, cotton production in green, that's mostly the South. States, we don't have Texas yet at this time, but states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina right there, okay? That's the South. They're mainly agricultural. You could see manufacturing as that little factory symbol. There's very few manufacturing centers in the southern part of the United States. Most of those are up here in New England, which is in the north. You can see textile mills, like we talked about the Low Girls, where they have the big looms and stuff, the power looms powered by the fast moving water currents from northern rivers. Those are basically almost all right here in New England again. And so that is why Southerners are furious with this. Now, Daniel Webster, he is a Northern senator from Massachusetts. He is going to be talking about how, when I just realized I forgot something important during the Trail of Tears. I knew I was forgetting something. I always do that. Like I go back and I was like, I knew I forgot to say something. This right here, right? This right here, okay? This tariff debate is part of a larger debate happening in America at this time that won't conclude until the Civil War. It's about the role of the federal government and about who controls power in the federal government. And it's about also the issue of slavery. That's all going to be decided in the Civil War, right? At this time in the 1830s, we're already moving towards that great issue that will divide the nation. We see this under Jackson's presidency. But in the Trail of Tears, in the debate, remember that there are many in the North who did not want to forcibly relocate the 5 civilized tribes. But however, they get basically overridden by the Southern interest, and the South only has the votes to make sure Indian removal happens because of the 3/5 compromise originally written into the Constitution. And that was where, if you are an enslaved African American person, you would be counted for apportionment in Congress as 3/5 of a person. So 3 out of 5 would count towards the census in dividing up basically how many congressmen every state would get. That gave the South more votes than they would have had if, remember, slaves had not been counted as people at all, but rather as property, as many Southerners viewed them. So that 3/5 compromise gave the South the necessary votes to secure Indian removal and thus give the South more land, like states like Alabama, Mississippi, and so on, now that these Indians are cleared from it, to turn into cotton plantations and other plantations for their agricultural booming economy. So I just wanted to mention that real quick before we get further into our tariff debate. Okay, so Daniel Webster is afraid of population loss if the North can't maintain its manufacturing hold. Keep in mind that America, as a mercantilist colonies under the British, from where we came from, did not have a strong history of manufacturing. Britain did that for us. We supplied the raw materials. That was the nature of the triangular trade, right? If we want to be an independent, powerful nation on our own, Northerners like Daniel Webster are arguing, we needed to protect our nascent, our new American manufacturing interests. And that meant a tariff because, it a tariff makes it more expensive to buy stuff made elsewhere. It means that it's easier to buy stuff made in America. It'll encourage Americans to buy American made goods, and that'll help out our new factories and industries. So that's the basics of the debate. And of course, Westerners, they're kind of mixed on this, but like Henry Clay, he's a big proponent of the tariff. But it's North kind of versus South, and really New England versus kind of the South and West. And like I said, the larger debate is on the nature of politics and the role of the federal government. And Southerners are terrified, and we'll see this again and again and again. Like we first saw the Missouri Compromise, they are terrified that if the North has too much power, eventually the issue of slavery will get to come up in Congress, and slavery will be brought down. And why are they terrified of this? Because slavery forms the foundation of the Southern economy and the Southern way of life. Their economy rests on being able to mass produce, cash crops. You cannot do that without a large, cheap labor force, such as slaves. And that's how you had these super uber rich planter class, who is like the wealthy, 1% down in the South that controlled everything. So if slavery were able to be questioned in Congress, it would bring down their whole system. And so this tariff debate is part of this larger debate. Just keep that in mind. That's why people got so passionate about this. And the Webster-Hayne debate in the Senate floor in Congress, that just kind of is indicative of where we're going. Daniel Webster, he gave his response to Hayne over the course of 3 days. So obviously I'm not going to read you like all of his speeches, but Daniel Webster is cementing himself as like a key voice for the North. And he even predicts that, if we allow the South to push the nation around like this will be the end of the Union as we know it. It'll be brother versus brother, North versus South. It will come to blood if we allow states like South Carolina here. That's where Robert Hayne is from. That's where the sitting vice president, John C. Calhoun, is from. They're the ones really fighting against this tariff from 1828. If we allow them to push us around, this could, be the dissolution of our entire country. Why did we throw out the Articles of Confederation to begin with, right? It's because they were weak. They didn't work. Having states have all the power, letting South Carolina as a state boss around the federal government is not going to work. We've seen that. That's why we had to throw the articles in the trash and create a new, stronger government, the Constitution. And so that's what's going on. John C. Calhoun, by the way, was the vice president of John Quincy Adams, who signed this tariff into law in 1828. And then John C. Calhoun will go on to become Jackson's vice president. But meanwhile, while the election's happening, Calhoun is going to write the South Carolina exposition, which is basically his response in South Carolina's view on why this tariff was so terrible. And it's kind of hearkening back to an earlier similar letter that we've seen, actually 2 of them, called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, written respectively by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Madison and Jefferson, they were furious at the first Adams, the father, John Adams, second president, his passage, his signing into law of the Alien and Sedition Acts during the Quasi-War with France. They said that those violated Americans, American citizens' natural rights under the Constitution, especially the freedom of speech, and many other freedoms. And so They basically said in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that if a state believes that a federal law is unconstitutional, is illegal, is unjust, a state has the power to nullify that law. Um, Now, they don't go so far as to say what would happen if the federal government fights back against the state's nullification power or interposition power, as they're creating. Um, Calhoun will actually go further with his South Carolina exposition, and he will say that a state not only has the right to nullify a federal law or a tax in this case, as it deems it unjust, but can also secede if it fails to find justice. And secession is when you literally break away from the union. So Calhoun he's getting it. And meanwhile, the election takes place. Now we have General Jackson as president, and Thomas Jefferson's birthday comes up, April 13th, 1830. And Thomas Jefferson, he died in 1826. In fact, I think I mentioned this before, but it is worth mentioning again. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day. They died July 4th, 1826. So that was actually was quite the thing, right? That John Quincy Adams was president of the United States when his father died. But Adams' last words were, "At least Jefferson lives," and they had continued correspondence into their later years and had renewed their friendship after all the ugliness of the politics. And so that was his last words. And then he didn't know, being there in Braintree, Massachusetts, that basically Jefferson had just died 3 hours earlier. And both of them dying, these two American founding fathers, John Adams had helped to write the Declaration. Jefferson was the main author of the Declaration of Independence. Adams was our second president. Jefferson was our third president. They were huge, American founding fathers. Both of them dying on July 4th led many people to go back through and try to find some uniqueness to that day, significance to July 4th, because actually July 2nd had been the date of our independence when the Lee Resolution was passed through the Second Continental Congress and we declared ourselves free. But July 4th was actually the day that the language for the Declaration of Independence was approved. And so that's why July 4th has since become known as our Independence Day. And that is the day that we celebrate with fireworks and picnics and apple pie and Americanism. Whereas ironically, John Adams himself had said of July 2nd that would be the day with such surrounding festivities. So all that being said, Thomas Jefferson is still super important in the American psyche at this time. Like, there's only the Democratic Republican Party at this point, even though we've seen opposition rise up and now, the Democrats have risen up from it. If you wanted to make it anywhere in politics, you still got to pay homage to the original king of the Democratic Republicans and Republicanism in America, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. So his birthday was a huge celebration. And all of the Washington political elites would gather and basically toast Thomas Jefferson on April 13th and give toasts, which toast back at this time, you raise your glass. Here's my fancy fluted glass, pretend, and you say, "To the nation," or "To America." You give a toast. It was a much bigger deal back then than it is today. Well, this is the first chance that anybody's going to have to hear what Jackson himself believes on the issue of the tariff. And everybody's kind of holding their breath because Jackson is a Westerner and he was born a Southerner. He is a slave owner. How is he going to feel about all this? And Jackson, at this dinner, toasting Thomas Jefferson's birth, basically says, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." So he actually goes the way of Daniel Webster, the Northerner. Nobody saw this coming, but they should have, because if you'll recall, even though Jackson was a Southerner and a slave owner and a Westerner in many ways, he also was a man of the Union. He had served for decades in the United States military. Remember the hero at the Battle of New Orleans. Remember the Seminole War in 1818, 1819. Remember the Creek War. Remember, Jackson had been a member of the Senate in Congress. Remember, Jackson had been now president of the United States. And so Jackson believes above all else in the sanctity of the United States government. And anything that threatens that sanctity, he saw as, something that was a threat to himself personally, and he was going to take it down. So our federal union, it must be preserved. He basically is saying what South Carolina's describing in their exposition, that surprise, nobody was fooled. Like, everybody knew John C. Calhoun was the author of the South Carolina Exposition, vice president of the United States. Jackson basically looks straight at Calhoun during the toast and says, our federal union, it must be preserved. He's telling Calhoun, and he's telling, by extension, South Carolina, if you try to follow this doctrine of nullification, I won't let you. I will find, he told one South Carolinian personally to run down to South Carolina and relay his words. He basically said, if you refuse to follow this tariff, I will go down there myself, and the first defier that I see, I will hang up by the first tree that I find. Jackson's not playing around, and Jackson loved to fight. Okay. Calhoun himself is going to respond and say something like, next to liberty most dear, our union. And so this is something that, like, Hayne had said during the Webster-Hayne debate and stuff. But basically, Calhoun is saying, this is about freedom for the South against unjust tyranny. He saw this tax, this tariff, as unfair, and as their freedom and right to try to avoid it, basically. So this is the final death nail between the two men. And this took place over several years. And remember, the Petticoat Affair had also played a large part in splitting up Jackson and Calhoun. But after this toast, basically Calhoun, who had been spending a lot of time in his South Carolina plantation anyway, because there's not a lot for the vice president of the United States to do, he is going to leave Washington, D.C., go back to his plantation, and he is going to eventually resign the vice presidency. And we know that eventually the vice presidency will go to Jackson's main right-hand man, Martin Van Buren. So that is the Jefferson Day toasts, and it's just going to get worse from here, basically, with the tariff debate, because Calhoun, remember, he's basically saying in nullification that his state, South Carolina, they hate this tariff. They are going to nullify the tariff. They're not going to follow it. They're not going to pay the extra tax. And he looks to what Jefferson and Madison had stated in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, this idea of nullification. It goes back to the 4th article of the Constitution, the idea of federalism. It goes back to the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, which gives states' rights to anything not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. But doing this, he also says that if the United States tries to press the issue, South Carolina has a right to secede from the Union. It can break away. Now, Jackson is having none of this, okay? He is going to push Congress to pass a force bill that will give President Jackson the ability to send a military down and enforce this tariff. South Carolina, they begin trying to enlist an army from the states, get up to like 28,000 recruits. I mean, this is starting to look a little bit like the Civil War, and this is in the early 1830s. But the force bill does pay off, because everybody knew that Jackson is not to be trifled with, okay? He does not back down from a fight. When he said that he was going to personally go down to South Carolina and hang the first traitor that he saw by the first tree that he came across, people knew he wasn't bluffing. He would actually do that. Okay, this is the man that still had like a bullet lodged in his body from a duel. He'd survived many duels. So he's not going to blink. And with the threats of Jackson sending a military down, and without also any other Southern states joining South Carolina in this venture, eventually here comes Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, kind of leader of Congress, with another compromise, just as he'd come in with like the Missouri Compromise. And in this compromise bill in 1832, it creates a new tariff with reduced levels, something that South Carolina can be a little bit more okay with. And with the force bill and with this new tariff that reduces the overall tax on imports, South Carolina is going to kind of back down. But then kind of belligerently, they still decide to nullify that force bill because, yeah, tough guys. But the crisis was averted. So that's what we call the nullification crisis. Keep in mind that, I mean, that was an early point where we just avoided having a civil war, but nothing was really resolved. So these issues will come back again and again until we get to the Civil War in the 1860s, just like 30 years later. I love this picture right here. Let me make sure you can see it. So right here we have President Andrew Jackson with a cane. He was speaking with Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee. Crockett had actually been an outspoken critic of the Indian Removal Act and will later go in 1836 to Texas and join in the Texas Revolution and famously find his end at the Alamo, the last stand there in San Antonio. But while he was talking with Congressman Davy Crockett, Jackson and Crockett were accosted by a assassin who literally tried to shoot President Jackson point blank. Can't avoid that, Mr. Duelist. But the gun backfired, and Jackson, with his cane, started beating the assassin. And finally, he was beating the man so bloody, the president of the United States, that Crockett had to pull Jackson off of the assassin. And I just think that's a wonderful story about the kind of man that Jackson was. Even if some of the details might have gotten skewed throughout history. There you go. If you haven't noticed by now, Jackson loves a fight, okay? He fought and refused to back down on the Petticoat Affair until most of his cabinet had resigned or was replaced. He believed in rotation in office, he called it. Meant he went through a lot of cabinet members. Jackson refused to back down on the nullification crisis over the tariff debate when South Carolina threatened to basically not follow federal laws and taxes. Jackson was willing to send in the military and put their rebellion down. That was the nullification crisis. And now we're going to see Jackson again. Don't mess with him. He's not going to back down from a fight against the bank. And this is known as the Bank Wars. Now, the first bus, or Bank of the United States, was chartered by Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Treasury Secretary under George Washington, back in the 1790s. And its initial charter expired in 1811, but due to the financial circumstances surrounding the War of 1812, they do recharter a second Bank of the United States for 20 years in 1816. So in 1836, the second bus, or Bank of the United States, was set to expire. The second Bank of the United States is going to be run by its president, Nicholas Biddle. He is a nonpartisan, so he is trying to stay out of politics, but he is going to be dragged into the political fray. Let me move this down a little bit. Okay, well, that works. There we go. He's going to be dragged into the politics by Henry Clay. Remember, there's no love lost between Henry Clay and Jackson after all the ugliness of the 1828 presidential election. In fact, Jackson basically blames Clay for Rachel's death, his wife's death, because of all the nasty rumors and remember the adulteress, all that stuff that was going on. You can refer back to the earlier lecture for that. So Henry Clay, he wants to take Jackson down, and Jackson's popularity among the common folk was really strong. So the only way Clay felt he could get some leverage against Jackson was making the bank an issue, because Jackson had already publicly stated in his inaugural address and several other instances that Jackson derides the bank. He sees the bank as being in the moneyed interest of the North and the financiers, and is a real problem for the common people just looking to lend and pay back debts and other stuff. These bankers, they're just interested in their own personal gain. It's a popular argument to make. Who's going to argue against that except for the bankers, right? So Henry Clay pushes for an early rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States in 1832, so 4 years ahead of schedule. And he does this because 1832 just so happened to also be an election year. Jackson is running for re-election. So Clay is forcing the issue of the bank politically on Jackson's plate because Clay has the votes in Congress to push forth the rechartering. And it goes through the House, it goes to the Senate, and now remember the last step for a bill to become a law for the bank to get renewed is it goes on the president's desk, and Jackson would either have to sign or veto it. Now, a veto is when a president basically refuses to accept a law. He gets rid of it. And it can go back to Congress for an override, but it takes a 2/3 supermajority in order to override a presidential veto. Now, up until this time, the previous 6 presidents before Jackson, they had only used the veto 10 times in the history of our country. Jackson already had used the veto more than all 6 of his previous predecessors combined. But this veto was the one that people are really going to remember because Jackson straight up vetoes the bank, saying, I'm not going to recharter it. He didn't pick this fight, but he's going to win it because he's Andrew Jackson. He don't back down from a fight, especially one that was brought to his doorstep by somebody he hates as much as he hated Henry Clay. So that is the beginning of the bank war. Now in the election, so this was all just a few months before the election. In the election, the people overwhelmingly again re-elect Andrew Jackson. So he's now reelected for another 4 years. And Jackson is going to see this as a mandate, basically an order from the people, giving him the justification and the powers he needs to actually go and kill the bank. And so he begins to take out money from the national bank, the Bank of the United States, and put it into what becomes known as the pet banks. These were like 26 or so state banks that Jackson had given priority to, that he's going to take the revenue of the United States, our tax dollars and everything else. Instead of going into the national bank, it'll go into these various state banks. They were called pet banks derisively because, like a teacher's pet, these are like the favored banks. And it is super kind of corrupt if you think about it. Like, why decide one bank or another? There's a lot of special favors going on. There's a lot of moneyed interest. Back in the original debate in Congress itself over the rechartering of the bank, Daniel Webster, again, that northern senator, he's championing the national bank and saying, we need it. We need it because it regulates our money. It makes sure that we don't have rampant inflation. It makes sure that lending is happening appropriately, interest rates and stability, reign. However, while he's saying all this, and it's all true, it was also be true of like state banks to a certain extent. But remember, a national bank provides regulation on money for the entire country, not just on certain banks. So there's that. But while he's saying all this and arguing all this, Daniel Webster was like a lawyer for the bank. So of course he believed that. And then people like Missouri Senator Benton, they were arguing against the bank because the bank, directly went against their personal plantation interests. So, I mean, everybody has personal interest at stake here. But for Jackson, this was a fight. And now that he was reelected by the people, he sees the people are on his side. Most of the common folk, they don't trust this bank either. So he's going to kill it. So he removes the money, puts it into these pet banks. And the pet banks, they start to print their own paper money, which is going to make a future problem we will talk about a little bit later on, called the Panic of 1837, which Jackson will not really have to deal with. It'll be his successor, Martin Van Buren, whose machinations had created this whole thing, who will actually have to deal with that depression that's coming up because of all this. But the bank does lose out. Nicholas Biddle does lose the fight, and the Second Bank of the United States, when its final recharter does come up in 1836, it will not be rechartered. It will die off, and we won't really have major federal oversight of the banking industry until the Civil War. And then later on, it'll still be a problem until we get in 1913 the creation under progressive President Woodrow Wilson of what we call the Federal Reserve. Now, as far as leading up to this depression, this panic of 1837, the president of the bank, again, this guy, Nicholas Biddle, he's trying to show the country why a national bank is important, right? Because it regulates the financing and banking interest of the country. It's where the nation's money goes into. It's what prints the money and regulates the amount of circulation of money in America. So he calls in the loans to illustrate the importance of the national bank, to show that it's invaluable to our country. And he does a bit too good of a job on this, because when the national bank calls in its loans to the state banks, many of these pet banks, they are going to have trouble paying it back, especially in the species money. That's the hard, like gold and silver money. Instead, they just were printing off that paper money. And so many of these state banks, they go under, and they then have to call in their loans that many, private parties, individuals, average people had made from these banks, which they can't pay back. And then you get into a depression. And so that is the bank wars. Jackson wins, but the nation kind of loses, because we hit a bit of a panic right after this. All right. And we'll return to Jackson, but in our next lecture, we're going to hit the pause and turn to a religious movement that was going through America in the early 1830s, the Second Great Awakening, like 100 years after the First Great Awakening. That's going to trigger a lot of the very important reform movements gripping our country. All right, thank you guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye.